Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, we're going to open up day 7 of the Spellbinders Crafty Advent Calendar for 2024. So if you don't want to see what's in day 7, save this video to watch later because I'm opening up right now and then I'm going to create something with it. So with this day, we get this really cute 3-piece layering stencil. It fits a half a piece of 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch cardstock, so it's perfect for stenciling on for an A2 card. Now, because it's 4 1/4 inches wide, it makes placement really easy. So I have a piece of 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch Hammermill cardstock here. I'm just going to tape it to my surface. You could use a sticky mat if you wanted to, but I didn't feel that it was going to be super helpful because this needs to be taped down anyways, because my stencil is the same size or the same width as my cardstock. There's nothing that's overhanging it. Now, the one thing about these stencils is there are 4 little holes, one in each of the corners, and you could put a pencil mark in there to help with registration marks. I find sometimes when I'm stenciling, I lose or I stop paying attention to those holes and sometimes I get ink in them. So rather than using pencil marks for registration marks, I'm just putting some tape right over top of it and I'm lining up the stencil with the outside top and 2 sides of the cardstock that I'm stenciling on, and then when I flip it over to do the bottom, I will line it up with the bottom and then the 2 sides. So for this first layer here, most of it is stems, so I'm using some peeled paint distress ink. I'm using detailed ink blending brushes for all the stenciling in this video because I'm going to have a lot more control over it, as well as the fact that the areas are fairly small. So if I want to do any shading, the detailed ink blending brushes are going to be a little bit more helpful with that. So I have ones that I've already used with ink before, and before I went and put that pink brush into the pink ink, I decided to just put it on the cardstock and see if there was any ink in my brush, and there was some. So I have some ink down already. I was going to use picked raspberry for that one, but I just used whatever ink was on the brush. Chances are there was a bunch of picked raspberry in there mixed with a few other colors, but I ended up not using or not having to dip that brush into ink. The layers for that particular flower, they get progressively bigger and I wanted them to get progressively lighter. So I just used the rest of the ink that is on my brush. For the peeled paint, I concentrate and I start every time I dip my brush into my ink pad, I start at the base of the leaves or the base of the stem so that the darkest area is going to be there. And then I do the rest of that stem just with whatever ink is left on the brush. And I go both clockwise and counterclockwise to make sure that I get all of the edges of the brush, of the stencil. So once I'm done that one, I can take all of those pieces of tape off of there. This is just some Best Ever Craft tape. This long piece here that I'm putting on the bottom, I did put it on my t-shirt a couple times just to take some of the excess sticky off of it to make it a little bit easier to remove from the cardstock. These pieces of tape I will just reuse over and over again until they don't stick anymore. And I like the thicker one for this particular use because if I lose track of my ink blending or if I'm using larger brushes, I don't have to worry about going over the edge of the stencil and accidentally getting some on my cardstock. Because I'm using detailed brushes here, I really don't have to worry too much about that, but it's nice to have that in mind. For the smaller flowers on this stencil, I am using some Tumbled glass, which is the blue color, as well as Wilted violet, which is the purple. So I put the blue on the little buds from the stems, and I put a tiny little bit on the top of the flower or the larger flowers, and then I put some of that Wilted violet on the bottom of it. Once again, starting my brush where I wanted the color to be the darkest, and then doing the rest of the area with whatever ink was on my brush already. Often, if I just need a tiny little bit of color, I'll just pull it from off of the stencil, because sometimes you've got a little bit of ink there, and it's usually just enough to even things out or fill in an area. Again, if you need more ink, you can grab it whenever you need it, but start where you want the color to be a little bit darker. Because these brushes are a lot smaller, they're a little bit harder to get a really even blended look. So once I have the majority of the excess of the ink off of my brush, I will just keep using a stenciling motion just to get as much of the ink off and blend everything together as much as possible, and it tends to create a little bit more of a smoother blend. Now again, with this stencil, because as soon as the top part is done, I just move it to the bottom, lining everything back up. So for the second stencil here, not only do I line up the edges of the stencil, but I also make sure that the leaves are lined up with the lower branches. I wanted to make sure that that was perfectly lined up because it would make it look a little bit odd if the leaves were offset. So there was a tiny little bit of adjustment once I had lined up the top and the sides, and then the bottom and the sides, and then I just adjusted it slightly to make sure that those leaves were positioned properly. For those leaves, I used some bundled sage. It's in the same color family as the peeled paint, but it's just a lighter tone. Once again, starting at the base of the stem and then working my way up so that the darker leaves were at the bottom, lighter leaves are at the top. And the stenciling for the bottom is exactly the same as the stenciling on the top. I love layering stencils like these because you can get really fun and creative with whatever colors you use. You could also use sprays if you wanted. However, because this stencil is so small, you would need to make sure to mask off the entire area of the cardstock that you're not stenciling on if you're going to use some sprays. But that is a fun way to get some extra shimmer in there. I often like to use these layer stencils with some texture paste or glitter paste to get a different texture or some sparkle in some areas. I chose not to do it with this one because the areas that I normally would do that with would be the center of the flowers and then the little circle on the tip of the buds. And because those are on two different stencils, I would have had to wait for that paste to completely dry between applications, as well as the fact that because there would be paste from one stencil when I placed the second one down, it'd be a little bit harder to get a clean edge on it because some of the area would be raised. So rather than using some paste with this one, I ended up using just some Stickles glitter glue. It comes in a fine bottle and I can be very precise with it and get that glitter where I want it to go. For this last stencil, we have the larger pink flower in the center, as well as just some little purple dots that I'm putting on top of those blue little flower buds there. And then I'm using that bundled sage once again to do the upper part of the leaves. For this stencil, I did exactly the same thing as I did with the second one. I lined up the top and the two sides, and then just paid attention to where those leaves were on the branch and just made sure that they lined up with the branch as well. Again, it took a tiny little adjustment just to make sure that they were properly aligned, but it's easy enough to do. And because, once again, I'm using detailed ink blending brushes with these inks, I don't really have to worry about getting the ink where I don't want it to go. I can be fairly precise with it. You may notice as I'm stenciling, there's a line in the center or a space between the two images. That is going to be the perfect space for a sentiment to go in the middle of the card. Another way that you could enhance this stenciled image is you could use some floral dies, die cut some florals, and then add them to that as well to get a little bit more texture and dimension to it. Now that I'm done my stenciling, I'm just going to put the Stickles on there and leave that to dry for a while. Depending on your thickness, it just depends on how long it's going to take to dry. The ink that I'm using on the stencils will just rinse off with water. You don't need any special cleaners or anything. So I've left my image there to dry. The Stickles in the center of the bigger flowers isn't totally dry yet. It's mostly, but it's not totally dry. So I'm just going to put it to the side for just a few moments while I do the other details. Now I'm using the sentiment die set from day 4, and you'll notice when I first had it in there, the sentiment part didn't line up. It didn't have the right curvature to it. Just flip it over. So if you notice that you have, or that it just doesn't work, it doesn't align up properly, you have it in the wrong way, just flip it over 180 degrees and it will work properly. It'll be lined up a lot better. I do use that same Best Ever craft tape to tape everything together when I'm die cutting it to make sure that none of it shifts. And then I'm just using the outline die, and I'm going to die cut a couple extra pieces. So this piece of Dahlia cardstock here, I have cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. It's going to be the mat around my image. And I'm cutting those pieces out of the center because the image is going to cover it. You're never going to know that there was something cut out of that center. So we might as well utilize some of that cardstock. Now, were I to do this again, I would cut that piece 4 1/8 by 5 3/8 and then cut my stenciled piece down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. But because I had already cut this piece down, I needed to cut my stenciled piece down a little bit more than I really wanted. So I ended up cutting that down to 3 3/4 inch by 5 inches. So there's a 1/4 inch difference between the different measurements between the layers. So you'll notice when I go to cut that down, I cut a tiny little bit off of the flowers on the top and the bottom. The other option would be to cut your paper down ahead of time and then just lower your stencil just a tiny little bit. It's going to leave a little bit narrower area for your sentiment in the center, but it'll be fine. It'll work out well, and you wouldn't need to cut those florals off or cut a little bit of those inked florals. Now you'll notice while I'm cutting with my guillotine trimmer here, I'm wiping off the underside of the blade. That's where some of those stickles are wiping off and going on the blade, and I'm just trying to make sure that it's not going to transfer to the next area that I'm cutting. If I were to take too much stickles off, I would just reapply it once the card is assembled, but I found that because most of it had dried, it really wasn't too bad. Typically, I would wait until it was completely dried before trimming it down, but I got a little bit impatient. I'm sure some of you can understand. So now that I have those layers glued down, I could glue on the sentiment. I cut a couple extra pieces of that sentiment to layer up to give it a little bit of extra dimension, and I glued everything with Barely Art glue in a fine tip bottle so I can shimmy and move things and make sure that everything is lined up. So here we have our adorable stenciled image with the sentiment in the center. I love how easy that layering stencil was to use and to layer together. Thank you so much for watching for day 7. I really appreciate you being here. I will see you tomorrow for day 8.